In 19th century Britain, the winds of change were sweeping across the political landscape. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society, giving rise to a new class of industrialists, workers, and reformers who challenged the old order. Central to these changes was the struggle for electoral reform, a movement aimed at expanding the franchise and making the electoral system more representative of the burgeoning population. The British electoral system of the early 1800s was characterized by its irregularities and inefficiencies. One of the most glaring issues was the existence of rotten boroughs. These were parliamentary constituencies with very few voters, but still allocated a significant number of representatives in the House of Commons. Conversely, rapidly growing industrial towns and cities with burgeoning populations were often underrepresented. For example, the borough of Old Sarum had only a handful of voters but was entitled to 2 members of Parliament, MPs, while Manchester, with its booming population, had no representation at all. This imbalance was a product of the medieval electoral system, which had failed to adapt to the demographic and economic changes of the 19th century. The first major step toward electoral reform came with the passage of the Great Reform Act of 1832. This landmark legislation, also known as the Reform Act, was driven by widespread public agitation and demands for change. Key figures in the reform movement, such as the Whig Prime Minister Earl Grey and his ally Lord John Russell, championed the cause. The Great Reform Act sought to address some of the most egregious disparities in the electoral system. It abolished many of the rotten boroughs, redistributed parliamentary seats to better reflect population changes, and extended the franchise to include more of the middle class. Specifically, it lowered the property qualifications for voting, allowing a broader segment of the male middle class to participate in elections. While the act was a significant step forward, it did not extend voting rights to all men, let alone women, and did not address the inequalities faced by the working class. Nonetheless, it was a critical turning point in British political history, setting a precedent for future reforms. The 1830s and 1840s saw the rise of the Chartist movement, which sought more radical changes. Chartists, named after the People's Charter of 1838, demanded 6 key reforms: universal male suffrage, the secret ballot, equal electoral districts, annual parliaments, abolition of property qualifications for MPs, and payment for MPs. This movement represented the aspirations of the working class and was driven by widespread discontent with the slow pace of reform. Despite their massive public support and numerous petitions, the Chartists faced resistance from the political establishment. Their demands for universal male suffrage and other reforms were not immediately met, but the movement played a crucial role in raising awareness and building momentum for further changes. The pressure from movements like the Chartists and the growing demands for a more equitable system eventually led to further reforms. The Reform Act of 1867, also known as the Second Reform Act, significantly expanded the electorate by lowering property qualifications and extending the franchise to more working-class men. This act doubled the number of voters and marked a substantial shift towards a more representative democracy. The final major reform of the century came with the Reform Act of 1884, also known as the Third Reform Act. This legislation extended the voting rights granted by the 1867 Act to rural areas, bringing them in line with urban constituencies. It effectively enfranchised the majority of adult males in Britain and represented a crucial step toward a more universal male suffrage. By the end of the 19th century, Britain had made significant strides towards a more inclusive and representative electoral system. The reforms of 1832, 1867, and 1884 addressed many of the most glaring injustices in the electoral system, setting the stage for future progress. However, the century's reforms did not fully resolve the issues of electoral inequality. Women remained excluded from voting, and it would take the early 20th century to achieve suffrage for women with the Representation of the People Act of 1918 and the Equal Franchise Act of 1928. The 19th century reforms in Britain were not just about altering voting rights. They were about reshaping the political landscape to better reflect the changing society. They demonstrated the power of reform movements and public pressure in driving political change and laid the foundation for a more inclusive democracy. In reflecting on this era, we see a nation grappling with the demands of a rapidly evolving society, striving to align its democratic institutions with the principles of fairness and representation. The journey of electoral reform in 19th century Britain illustrates the ongoing quest for a more just and representative political system, a journey that continues to inspire and inform democratic movements around the world.